no predicting what's going to happen on these things. So what we're going to do, unfortunately, is because no one could hear Earl's first answer. I'm going to run quickly through the concept of, that we want to thank everyone. We want to make sure, and I was told that we went through the numbers too fast. So if you want to get the deck, it'll be downloadable in about 29 minutes at our website, which is www.hyperionresearch.com. And you can download the deck there, as I said, it'll become live in the next 30 minutes. And the other point I want to make is that at the same time, in the next 30 minutes, you're going to get a survey email from us that invites you to take about a 4 or 5 minute survey to give us a sense of some of the high points and unfortunately some of the low points. There's actually a thing in there about audio quality that I'm sure I know where that's going to go. But what we're interested in is your opinions on content. And things that we did that were interesting and things that we did that perhaps weren't so interesting. But I think most importantly, we want to know some of the topics that we have to cover next year. So in our next briefing, what are some of the new and interesting, compelling, bright, shiny objects in HPC that you'd like to see us do more coverage on? So so please fill out that survey. If you don't get it within the next hour, check your spam folder, your clutter folder, your junk folder. And if it's not there, then drop us an email. We'll make sure you get that survey. So let's toss the first question to Earl. Actually, this worked out pretty well because we planned on the Q&A starting at 1 o'clock, and we actually did start on time, so good for us. So let's go with the first question to Earl. Earl, we have to start out with probably one of the most compelling issues of the day, and certainly one that the HPC community is engaged in writ large. Can you give us some of your insights on how the COVID virus situation has impacted things like exascale purchases and perhaps even the HPC buyer sector writ large?
Sure. Thank you, Bob. So the very high end of the market, or the exascale systems, these are very long-term procurements that have many steps in the whole process, from deciding what you want to purchase, designing a system, asking for bids. And then once those are in place, there's a tremendous amount of work done on the budgeting side, building construction in many cases. So what we've seen is almost no impact from the virus situation on the exascale installations. Now, there's always risk with R&D. So there's some delays from technology-wise and other pieces, and potentially if the virus continues for another year or so, there could be some delays on installation. But at the moment, we're not seeing any sizable impact or any impact we can tell whatsoever that's harming the exascale procurements. On the positive side, if one can use those terms, there is more funding being allocated for the very high end of the market to help combat COVID and the economic impacts, understand it, doing research to better understand potential solutions or different approaches. But everything, for example, in Fugaku has done a lot of modeling on whether or not what different types of masks are useful, like a face shield versus cloth masks and so on, and have found some very interesting things as far as some problems with just a clear, plexiglass face shield not being as useful as one may think it is. So we are not seeing any negative impacts on the exascale side of it. For HPC at large, the comments we mentioned about cloud computing very much is impacting the lower end of the market right now. And the lower end of the market, as I mentioned, is always hit the heaviest from economic downturns. So, that is an area that we are concerned with. But also, we're seeing just some regular shifts in the market itself. So overall, the impact, as we mentioned, was on the order of about a 14% decline. But in perspective, we thought it was going to be a 6 or 7% growth year. So you're still talking about a delta of about 20%, which is a very substantial change from the impact.
Great. Good. Thank you. Next question, I think, is probably best for Alex. Alex, some folks are interested in understanding how the cloud is changing the way data is stored and used for traditional mod sim HPC applications, as well as AI workloads.
Thanks, Bob. So I want to touch first on the AI portion of this. One of the things that we're seeing in the market is, as IoT and edge sensors continue to grow in data collection, many of those data sets are actually stored and held in clouds. So it's actually easier to train models on data that's already stored in the cloud rather than moving large data sets around. And effectively, you train your model in the cloud, and then you can export the result, the weights of that model for on-prem computing if you want to do an inference model on it. So we're seeing a rise in AI applications being run in the cloud because that's where much of the data is. In addition to the data collected from sensors or IoT, many public data sets are available through cloud platforms. So it's more effective to run where that data resides rather than moving it around.
Great, thanks, Alex. Continuing on a little bit about the cloud issue, Mark, some folks are eager to find out a little bit more about how file systems are evolving to respond to increasing AI and cloud adoption. What are some of the big changes you're seeing?
Sure, we're seeing some changes in the file systems that have been traditionally employed on HPC mod sim workloads that generally provided more homogeneous I/O profiles of with either metadata and the scratch and home directories and the scratch files that are generally segregated with their I/O profiles and storage needs. With the advent of AI, we're getting much more data-intensive workloads as well as a more mixed I/O profiles. When you're looking at the transfer sizes, access patterns, random and sequential, the data types, file or block or object. So the file systems are needed to adapt and evolve to be able to handle the more balanced or heterogeneous type of workloads than in the past that may have been more, more homogeneous in nature.
Great, thank you. Okay, I've got one. By the way, we're being far too civil as a team, so I'm going to throw out a question that everyone can answer one at a time, and hopefully maybe we'll get a little crosstalk perhaps. And the question is simply, what's happened this year that surprised you most, that this time last year you hadn't even considered, and this year it's something that's relatively jumped out and brought, grabbed your attention? And the thing, I'll start out by basically saying, I gave the talk a little bit about what's going on in the quantum world. And quite frankly, the thing that has surprised me most about quantum computing in the last year is the really great amount of interest that we've seen, not only from traditional HPC users who are looking for some performance gains on some critical workloads in mod sim, in optimization, and in artificial intelligence and machine learning, but also the great interest we've seen in more traditional enterprise IT shops, folks that heretofore wouldn't have considered themselves high performance computing users or even advanced computing users, but they understand that quantum computing offers some very interesting performance potentials. And as I like to say, that they're not interested in quantum supremacy, they're not interested in heretofore intractable solutions. They're interested in performance gains that perhaps may be as little as 40 or 50x what they have now. And they're looking at that as a competitive advantage. They're looking at as a way to really, I don't want to say, perhaps even steal a march on the competition. 40 to 50x performance gains in the HPC world is about, you have to wait 4 to 5 years for that kind of performance increase. So what people are looking for out of quantum is not, as I said, quantum supremacy. They're looking for basically some key applications to experience an acceleration that moves them about 4 to 5 years down the road when it comes to computational capability. As I said earlier, it's not unlike what we saw in the GPU world. Narrow applications with some very interesting performance that ultimately may start to proliferate out. So to me, that was the biggest surprise that I saw this year. So let's start off with Alex. What surprised you most about what happened in this year in HPC?
Thanks, Bob. I think what surprised me the most, and I use surprise in the sense that part of me anticipated it, but part of me was surprised by the magnitude of the movement towards the cloud. We had all seen really high growth following 2019, but in a number of recent studies, the uptick continues to go up at a very strong and aggressive rate. Users are trying to understand what portions of their application workload portfolio can run in the cloud and how to do that. And I think both the CSP's effort to address a number of HPC workloads, both traditional mod sim as well as AI, and the convergence of both of those, that I think has been the biggest surprise. That although we knew it was going to grow, the magnitude at which it's growing is partially due to, as I mentioned earlier, the virus, but also the interesting desire to have elastic variety of workload resources in HPC.
Great, thanks. Earl, you wanna take
Sure.
a crack at the question?
I love this question, by the way. So I'm going to skip over the virus thing because the virus impacts, of course, we did not forecast that a year ago. So that is kind of the uber surprise there. But the interesting thing to me last year, we were involved in a lot of discussions with a lot of governments around the world about governments continue to spend 500 million, 600 million, or in the case of Fugaku, $1 billion-ish a year, not a year, but on your major supercomputer systems. But I've seen that discussion evolve a little bit along the path because AI has become actually, to me, has moved out of the research stage to be actually practical. You know, we've actually, as Steve mentioned, some innovation awards already where AI is becoming real world and very important. But we're seeing a divergence in technologies. So the AI technologies, you know, for example, we've had many debates over who would use 64-bit processing for AI. I mean, you know, so fundamental different types of processes. As you mentioned, Bob, the quantum computing. So been involved in some discussions that, you know, if a quantum computer really works, why would you only have one in your site? Why wouldn't you have 2, 3, or 4 of them? Because each quantum computer may be designed for different tasks or different things. And obviously with AI, you probably want a different system. So maybe the plot curve of, you know, $35 million for your largest supercomputer 20 years ago, 100 million 10 years ago, today 300 million, 2 years from now 600 million. You plot that out and you start saying, hey, maybe the standard HPC, very high-end data center is going to be $1 billion system. Or maybe we're going to start talking about multiple billion-dollar HPC, you know, data centers. You know, so to me, that's one of the biggest surprises is that it's totally uncertain right now, you know, where it's going to land. But just the issue was, how could we ever continue at 500 to 600 million to the conversation of maybe we really do need to talk about the next growth path in that direction.
Right. I think we saw a little bit of that in the top 500 list, the fact that this was one of the most lethargic top 500 lists that we've seen in a long time, that machines are more expensive, but their life expectancy is expected to be longer. So you kind of, you know, if you integrate under the curve, you know, if you've got an expensive machine that lasts you 6 or 7 years, that may be more effective than a cheaper machine that only lasts you 3 years. Exactly. So there's some interesting debates, I think, that's going to happen going forward. Because my perception is these numbers can't continue to go up. The idea of building, you know, $1 billion plus systems are going to be an option available to a rapidly decreasing user base going forward. So Mark, what surprised you most this year?
Sure, last on the list. You guys took the low-hanging fruit. It was similar kind of to what Bob said relative to quantum, but I think the same can be said for AI. When you look at enterprises that, you know, maybe even couldn't spell HPC before, and maybe not even realize they're doing it now, but are adopting HPC-enabled AI techniques when they're applying AI to their business needs. Where traditionally HPC was in the realm of science and engineering, driving time to science and results and discovery. In the enterprise world, it's more traditional financial metrics and return on business investment, and how they're going to adopt that to make the business successful. So in turn of the enterprises adopting HPC, it's the vendors switching to be able to talk to and address a new market in a different way, and in talking in terms of the business needs and return on investment, as well as providing more turnkey solutions and more, you know, domain area expertise and support for the enterprise enabled that might not have the same bench strength in terms of domain expertise or the HPC infrastructure expertise. The vendors picking up the slack and filling that gap.
Great. So, okay, Mark, to be fair, since we only left you the high hanging fruit, I'm going to go right back to you with another question.
Okay.
Which I find an interesting one. Which can you talk a little bit about what you see in terms of new and innovative storage options at the edge? You know, we're all familiar with the fact that HPC centers are trying to, basically expand their presence by doing more and more processing where the data is gathered to alleviate data transfer requirements and such. What do you see from the storage perspective in terms of edge computing as it relates to the overall HPC architecture?
Yeah, I think Alex touched on it earlier with what he mentioned in the cloud, with really wanting and needing to minimize the data movement in the cloud for where the analysis needs to happen and simulation is occurring, or the inference and training happening. An awful lot of the expense in the cloud is today anyway from movement of data, and if the processing can be, and analysis can occur out where the data is generated and stored, and then only the results or the weights of the training model are transferred, that will minimize the overall expense and cost of operating in the cloud and at the edge. So innovations and investment is occurring on what that type of storage looks like, whether it's edge computing or storage servers out at the edge, and then the software to understand and manage where the data should be, when it should be moved, and identify times when it shouldn't be moved, and can keep just optimize and minimize the data movement.
Great, thank you. So Earl, I have to ask, because there has been some chatter around the community the last couple of weeks based on some of our recent findings of return on investment numbers and such. I just want to give you a little bit of opportunity to discuss, how you see the Hyperion Research ROI formalism and some of their numbers, and how they compare to some of the other kind of investment models or efforts to measure, the true economic impact of HPC purchase and research and product development and such.
Great, thanks. So a key part of the whole research program we have is that we're not just doing economic modeling of existing data, we're actually creating the raw data. And we're creating raw data for everyone to use in a very transparent form. In the past, people have always struggled with, how do you measure R&D? And the category of research we're doing is under the category of economic modeling of R&D programs. And the difficulty there is traditionally people, especially in the academic world, will simply look at number of publications and what I call secondary orders of effect. And the problem there is that it's not directly related to the actual return on the investment taking place. Now, the holy grail, or the thing that people really would like to have, is a complete economic model that would include every part of the process. So not just, the HPC investment, but the VC investment that goes in it, the hiring of the R&D people, and then everything, from building factories, hiring sales forces, accounting, human resources, and then, the end results in revenues and profits. Now, the issue is that you cannot collect that level of data across the board because most of it's confidential. So the traditional approach to that from an economic viewpoint, or macroeconomic modeling, is you look at certain inputs and certain outputs. And that's why our model looks at very specific and consistent inputs and outputs, and that's what we provided. Now, the interesting thing to me is there's over 6 countries right now that are using our data and our modeling approach. And what happens in some cases, for example, under the Obama administration, some of the White House economists said, hey, we like the data, but we actually like to use weighted averages. So they took our data and they used a different way of calculating off of our data. And we welcome that completely. In Europe, the EU also does a similar thing, because the EU has very specific definitions for revenues, costs, profits, and different pieces. And so they take our raw data and they apply a different set of models to our data to do their calculations. And so that's why we're providing the community not only the results of our model, not only the way our models work, our whole research, but also the raw data. And we're making that available to the broader community.
Oh, great, thank you. And I do want to stress that, in this particular endeavor, we've been very transparent about how the sausage is made. So you just go to the Hyperion Research website, and you can download all the information and play with your own conclusions, challenge our assumptions, reinforce your own. It's really about transparency more than just here's a number, here's $441 or whatever the research finding is. It's more about the process in many cases than anything else. I just did want to reiterate that point.
Right, and Bob, along those lines too, the one thing that we've been doing as analysts modeling the data is the data set right now has a lot of outliers in it. And by outliers, they're real examples. And so we've left them in the database, but the returns that they're getting are just unbelievably large. Some of the interesting ones, no surprise, in finance, but some of the banks are actually creating new products for social media. And I have to tell you, they're making a fortune off of it. No surprise to anyone, probably. The other one is in the oil gas sector. When you discover new major oil reserves, your returns on your investment, again, are staggering. But the other one that was fascinating to me was in the transportation area. And in this case, they only have to buy relatively small HPC systems, and they're able to measure it directly, and that's the amount of fuel. So this is truck routing for delivery of materials. And by using more advanced HPC, they're able to save a very large amount of money, but they only have to spend a couple $100,000 to do the research.
Great. Good deal. Thanks, Earl. I'm going to take moderator's privilege here and ask myself a question, which has been brought up by a few folks on our chat. Is what are some of the interesting quantum computing applications that you find that you've seen in the last 6 months or so? And to me, what I like about some of the applications that I've seen is, they manage to compress the complexity and the theoretical nature of what's going on in quantum computing algorithm research and translate it into some very simple and understandable use cases that are easily graspable. And they're things like what was done by a German automaker. And it was a way to really manage traffic flow from an airport to a downtown area. And now you may think, okay, I get that from Google every time I do Google Maps. And well, the answer is when you go into Google Maps and you see the red line on your regular route and Google basically says, go this way, you have to understand that they're telling everyone to go that way. So that supposed shortcut now is no longer a shortcut because everyone's taking it. Well, one of the interesting quantum applications was to figure out a way, and again, the key here was that it was done in near real time, was to figure out how to optimize everyone's trip from the airport to downtown, so no one experienced any undue delays, and spread them out over a number of different routes. And that's something that, again, is intractable on a classical system. But without a doubt, my favorite one, and it was just basically announced by a European aerospace manufacturer, Airbus. They've come up with some interesting research on the best way to load a plane when it pulls into the gate, and you have to get a whole bunch of luggage into the plane quickly and effectively. And simply to get the most luggage in there at the most weight, and also to make sure that the center of gravity of the plane doesn't change significantly, so you don't have any anxious moments when you try to lift the plane off. And this is something that Airbus is looking at quite seriously, because it is a pernicious problem in the airline sector, and the variables there are quite large. If anyone is listening is familiar with computer science, the idea of the knapsack problem, how to effectively load a number of different sized objects into a given knapsack, is a classic difficult problem. And to me, the idea that something as complicated and as seemingly theoretical as quantum computing is looking at opportunities to best load an airplane effectively is a great way to illustrate, the potential use cases and how innovative folks are being in terms of translating quantum computing capabilities into real world applications. I'm going to throw this question out to anyone who wants to grab it first. So hands on buzzers. We've heard lots of different things, certainly over the last few years, and this year was no exception in terms of the emergence of what's going on in terms of GPUs and their growing influence or growing use in HPC architectures. So really what I want to ask anyone who wants to jump in first is, how are GPUs changing HPC architectures writ large, and is that a good thing or a bad thing? Are we opening up new avenues of research but closing other ones down? What's your take on how GPUs have affected the HPC sector writ large, and if that's going to be a long-term or short-term impact? So somebody jump in here.
I'll jump in and start the conversation. So Great. First of all, I think it's definitely a long-term impact that we're seeing here, and if I look back at GPUs 10 years ago, they were, I'm going to argue, in somewhat of an experimental phase. They were, and by that I mean they were very useful, but only in a few areas. And in the last handful of years, they've definitely become very useful in many different areas. And I don't want to say they're mainstream yet, because even if you look at our numbers, the bulk of the systems don't have GPUs installed. And that's one advantage of using the cloud, is because you can get access to GPUs if you don't currently have them installed. But the growth rate that we've seen with GPUs is just phenomenal. And at the moment, we don't see any slowing down of that growth rate.
Great. Alex?
Yeah, if I could add to that, I think one of the things that GPUs have done to the HPC realm is they've also opened up the door for other accelerator type technologies to be adopted and used, especially as AI and HPC come together. GPUs are really good at a lot of things, but what end users, what researchers have noticed is that there are other areas where a GPU is good but not the most effective, and that there are other technologies that could be even more effective than a GPU. So what I've found really interesting and fun to track is some of these new technologies that they attempt to address some of the additional performances that are available for certain applications. One of the most interesting ones that we saw in the past year was the wafer scale chip from Cerebras, the really, really large accelerator for AI that I think opened the doors for the opportunity for new esoteric technologies to be adopted and integrated by HPC users. And that's been a very fun and interesting market to track over the past few years.
Great. Mark, anything to add?
Yeah, I would just add, I think it's certainly GPUs just have a voracious appetite for data, and so it's caused innovations and new solutions and architectures to be able to get the data in and out more quickly, get more data in and out more quickly, and likely accelerated, for example, the move in certain use cases to all flash type of solutions, as well as things like the other data intensive innovations in the GPU direct storage kind of access methods. And I think you'll see more coming in order to continue to feed the beast, as it were, with the GPU's need for data and to process and keep systems fully utilized and perform the inference and training for the AI workloads.
Great. All right, thank you very much. Okay, I see by the little clock on my computer that the first thing I'd like to do is certainly thank the team for spending their time and sharing their insights. Steve Conway was unfortunately unable to join us today, but if you have any questions geared specifically for Steve, drop him a note or drop someone at Hyperion a note. We'll make sure he gets to it and gets back to you. I certainly want to thank the audience for showing up today. We appreciate all the comments we got, all the questions we got, and we appreciate your continued interest in listening to what Hyperion Research has to say. And so to that end, I'll iterate one more time that the slide deck will not be emailed to you unless you specifically email us and request it. Otherwise, go to our website. It should be available in the next 45 seconds or so for you to download. Hopefully we get a rush to the website where everyone wants to see it. That'd be great. Don't forget the look for the feedback survey, which should be launching again in another 45 seconds or so. Otherwise, we want to thank you for showing up for the presentation. We hope to see you next year, and we hope to see you next year in person, so we can do this again over a big plate of bacon. But until then, definitely stay positive and test negative. And thank you very much for joining us today.